On this Good Friday, we could literally spend hours doing some scriptural archaeology and digging below the surface of the four gospel accounts of our Lord's crucifixion to discover all of the Old Testament echoes and allusions and shadow stories that form the background of what happens on the day that our Lord is crucified. But instead, I want to focus on one particular aspect of the story. And the reason I want to do this is because I think this part of the story is often misconstrued or misinterpreted to mean something that it really doesn't mean in its original context. What I'm talking about is one of the 7 last words that Jesus speaks from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, in my own experience, when I hear this verse preached on or read something about it, often it's interpreted to mean that this is the moment that Jesus is becoming sin and he's enduring hell, and the Father forsakes him, turns his back on him because of what he has become, sin. Now, I'm not discounting that particular understanding of what happens on the cross, but Psalm 22 verse 1 is not about that. Psalm 22 verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me, is about something else. It's about exile. It's about the exile that Jesus experiences on the cross for us. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is talk about Psalm 22 verse 1 and its entire context, and in particular I want to talk about that verb that occurs in the Hebrew in verse 1 of Psalm 22, the word for forsake. So on the cross, Jesus cries out in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Now, in the original Hebrew, it would have sounded different. Psalm 22 verse 1 in the Hebrew is Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. Now, that last word azavtani is from the root azav, and it typically is translated something like forsake. But it's used in a whole lot of different, over 200 times in the Old Testament. And it's used in a lot of different contexts, some positive, some negative. In fact, the very first time that azav is used is in Genesis chapter 2. It's a verse that we all know, that a man should leave his father and mother and should cleave to his wife. Now, that verb for leave is azav, the word that's translated as forsake in Psalm 22 verse 1. So it's this idea of separation, of creating a distance. Now, that particular word, when it occurs, for instance, in Deuteronomy and in the prophets, takes on a much more negative context. It's very often used, for instance, in Deuteronomy 31, it's used in 2 Chronicles, it's used in Jeremiah, to describe how, as Israel has azaved the covenant, as they have forsaken the covenant, or as they have azaved God himself, so God is going to azav the nation. He's going to forsake the nation, or he's going to forsake his house. And often in these contexts, what it's talking about is impending exile for Israel because of their sin. So they are going to go into exile, for instance, in Babylon, or the northern kingdoms are going to go in exile in Assyria. So azav, the word for forsake in Psalm 22, is freighted with all of these exilic connotations. So you could paraphrase Psalm 22 verse 1 in this way, my God, why have you exiled me? Why is there this distance between where I am and where you are? And this actually fits with a lot of the other verses in Psalm 22. 3 times, in fact, the Hebrew word for far off is used. In fact, it occurs in the second half of verse 1. So verse 1 of Psalm 22 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far off from saving me? And then that same word for far off also occurs in verse 11 and in verse 19. So the idea in the psalm is that the psalmist is experiencing exile from God. There's this distance that has been created between where he is and where God is. Now, this fits beautifully with the ministry of Jesus. In fact, in the Gospel of Matthew, which quotes this saying of Jesus, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, in the Gospel of Matthew, the theme of exile is huge. In fact, you could say that the theme of exile undergirds the whole story of Matthew. It starts out in chapter 1 of Matthew, we're talking about the Babylonian exile multiple times. And then Jesus himself, he retraces the life of Israel in Israel's exile. That's the reason that Jesus, as an infant, goes down into Egypt, where they had been exiled back in Exodus. And he returns from there. He also goes into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted by the devil, just like Israel was 40 years in the wilderness. So you have all of these exile themes in Matthew, because the waiting for the hope and the waiting for the Messiah was for him to come and to deliver Israel from exile, because even though they were on their own land, they were still under Roman rule. They were under pagan rule, and so they needed freedom. They needed the Messiah to come and to rescue them. Now, the way the Messiah does this, the way he brings them back from exile, is a very different way than what they anticipated, but that was the hope. And that's what happens in the life and ministry of Jesus. In fact, you could say that when Christ cries out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is the crescendo of a building momentum toward this particular event. So when he says, "Why have you forsaken me? Why have you exiled me?" he now reaches that climax, that climactic moment in which he experiences what he has been sent to experience. He is suffering as Israel reduced to one, really as humanity reduced down to one, in which he is exiled from the Father. Now, Psalm 22 says nothing whatsoever about the sin of the one who's praying it. In fact, it's the cry of the righteous one. It's the cry of this sinless, innocent one who is being treated as if he is sinful, as if he is unrighteous. And this, of course, fits with the ministry of Jesus, because even though he in and of himself knew no sin, he is the one who is taking on the sin of Israel, the sin of all humanity. Even though he's righteous in and of himself, he takes on our unrighteousness, and he does so in his exile from the Father. So, what is Jesus really saying when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He's saying, my God, why have you placed me far off? Why am I in exile? Why am I so far from you? And the reason he is, of course, is because that he has become Israel. He has become humanity. He is now enduring that ultimate exile in order that he might bring us back to the Father. Now, ironically, when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" quoting that first verse of Psalm 22, he's actually confessing hope. How? Well, if you look at the rest of Psalm 22, especially the latter third of the psalm, it's a declaration of praise and thanksgiving to God for hearing the prayer of the one who cries, "Why have you forsaken me?" So at the end of the psalm, it's positive, it's full of hope, it's full of joy, it's full of thanksgiving, because God has heard the one who prays this prayer. So this is really the Easter cry of thanksgiving for life at the end of Psalm 22. So even though Jesus only quotes the first verse of Psalm 22, of course, he knew the whole psalm. The Israelites knew the whole psalm. We can read the whole psalm. And so even though it starts out with the cry of forsakenness, it ends with the cry of blessedness, because God does hear the prayer of his servant who cries out. And he hears that prayer not just for the sake of the Messiah, but he hears it for the sake of all of us whom the Messiah embodies. In him, we are exiled from God, but also in him, we are brought back to the Father. And so we are reconciled to the one who has forsaken us. We are reconciled to the one who brings us home, who brings us back from our exiles of sin and death, in order that we might be reunited with him in grace and mercy that's found in the Messiah. So when you hear Jesus cry out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you azabed me?" What you're really hearing is not just a cry of pain and of suffering, but you're also hearing hints of hope, because that psalm goes on to declare the resurrection joy that we experience in the Messiah. So I hope that this has given you a little bit different and a little bit broader perspective exactly what Jesus is saying in Psalm 22 when he cries out, "Why have you forsaken me?" Because in that forsakenness, we also hear that we are brought back to our Father in this one who endures our death and who rests in the tomb and who rises triumphantly on Easter morning so that we might die and be buried and rise again with him. And may God bless your Good Friday meditations. Thanks for listening.